It wasn't rock and roll, in fact, but there was music and waiting to connect with me.
Doug Cosmo Clifford was never the band's frontman, nor the face splashed across magazine covers that fans cheered for at every appearance. But without him, timeless rock anthems like Fortunate Son, Bad Moon Rising, or Born on the Bayou might never have carried that driving, unshakable rhythm, the very pulse that made audiences nod their heads without even knowing why. In Creedence Clearwater Revival, the voice was John Fogerty. The soul was Southern music, but the heart that kept everything beating in time was Doug Clifford. In an era when drummers were often treated as the technical backline of a band, Clifford quietly did far more. He built structure, held the groove steady, and turned every song into an irresistible march. During CCR's blazing 4-year stretch in history, he didn't talk much, didn't step into the spotlight, but every strike of his drums rang out as a declaration. Great music needs an honest keeper of the beat. And when the lights went out, when the singing fell silent amid conflicts and a breakup, Clifford chose to keep going. He formed new bands, toured for decades under a name once sued, once dismissed as living off the past. But he never defended himself, because he knew true devotion needs no justification. It only needs to keep the rhythm alive for those still willing to listen. This is the story of the last drummer still standing after it all. A legend without titles, armed only with a snare, a pair of drumsticks, and an audience ready to hear. Early life. Doug Clifford was born on April 24, 1945 in Palo Alto, California, but his earliest memories are tied to the town of El Chorrito, a place he once described as quiet enough to hear yourself if you were willing to listen. Inside that home, silence did not mean peace. His parents divorced when Doug was still a child, and from then on he learned to regulate his emotions by pounding rhythms on anything that could make a sound. His father was a mechanic, a quiet man who worked hard and didn't believe in anything called art. No one recounted the details of the separation, but Doug himself admitted, "I didn't have a childhood filled with laughter. Music was the only thing that made me feel I existed." His mother, in sharp contrast, was the first and only one in the family to pursue art. She once sang in a vocal quartet that performed on local radio. She was the one who quietly lit the spark for what would become Doug's entire life. His childhood had no stage, no audience, only vinyl records and a turntable in the corner of the room. I listened to everything: Etta James, Bo Diddley, Little Richard, Elvis. The more I listened, the more certain I was this was the only language I truly understood, Doug recalled. Once, when the family moved, Doug asked his father to look after his stack of records. At the new house, he discovered some had broken. He didn't cry, but he said, "That was the first time I realized what matters to you may not matter to others." He met John Fogerty and Stu Cook at El Cerrito High School. All three were kids who didn't really belong anywhere, but they found each other through a shared passion for rhythm. Together, they formed a student band called the Blue Velvets, playing at school parties and making rough recordings with borrowed equipment. Nobody thought it was serious, except us, Doug said. While John leaned toward songwriting and Stu focused on the technical side, Doug chose to sit behind the drums. No one asked him to. That was simply where he felt he could control everything. I didn't like being the center. I liked keeping things in time and staying quiet when needed. Doug would later recall 2 moments that defined the rest of his life. The first time he saw Elvis on The Ed Sullivan Show, and the first time he watched Gene Krupa play drums on television. Elvis made me want to be an artist. Krupa made me understand that I could. This boy who grew up in a broken family didn't rebel, didn't give up. He simply kept drumming, beat by beat. I didn't have a father who said, "Good job, son," but I had a mother who never asked, "Why are you choosing this?" Doug Clifford. And that was why, even when the world didn't believe, he still picked up the sticks and moved forward. Early career. Doug Clifford did not come to music through glittering opportunities or the kind of chance discovery that launched many stars. But in the most practical way, he bought a worn-out drum kit with money earned from part-time jobs, assembled each piece by hand, and patiently struck the skins over and over until rhythm became instinct. From his early days at El Cerrito High School, he shared with John Fogerty and Stu Cook a common passion, turning music into an escape from the monotony of suburban life. They began with rehearsals in garages, nights playing at school dances or small diners, often facing audiences who simply did not care. But Doug never wavered. On the contrary, he treated those moments as lessons in keeping time no matter the circumstances. A squealing microphone, out-of-tune guitars, or crowds walking away mid-song. Their first band was called the Blue Velvets, a plain name, even outdated compared with the surging rock trends of the early 1960s. While most young groups chased after the Beatles or the Beach Boys with bright harmonies, they stuck to rough-edged instrumentals, covering blues and rock and roll standards. Clifford always emphasized his role. I didn't need to stand out. I was there to make the whole band better. At a time when most drummers wanted to show off with solos, Doug chose a short, tight, unfussy style, never flashy, but always precise. In 1964, they signed their first contract with Fantasy Records, a turning point that seemed promising but came with a heavy compromise. The label forced them to change their name to the Gollywogs, a racially insensitive moniker that had nothing to do with their music and meant nothing to the band. Doug and the others objected, but they were too young, too eager for someone to press their records, and in the end, they gave in. We thought, at least somebody's putting our music out, Doug recalled. Under that name, they were pushed into commercial pop. Single after single failed, leaving no mark. For Doug, who stayed loyal to his plain, honest drumming, the experience felt increasingly alien, as though he no longer belonged to the music they were forced to play. At the same time, a threat outside of music nearly ended the dream altogether. Both Doug Clifford and John Fogerty received draft notices at the height of the Vietnam War. Had they been sent overseas, the band would have been finished. John joined the Army Reserve, while Doug enlisted in the Coast Guard Reserve. Those choices, seemingly personal at the time, kept them safe and unintentionally saved the band. A little-known detail that proved decisive in CCR's survival. As a member of the Gollywogs, Doug Clifford was not the leader, but he was the one constant. When John and Stu wavered over the band's direction, when record executives demanded they play this way, write that way, Doug sat behind his drums, steady and unyielding, reminding everyone that the core of their identity was playing music, not pleasing a producer. Finally, in 1967, patience paid off. The group regained control, dropped the imposed name, and chose a new identity. Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR. The name was unique, capturing their essence, rooted, tied to working-class America, mysterious, yet memorable. It was not just a label, but a declaration of freedom, freedom from control, from failure, and toward a new era where Doug Clifford's drumming would no longer merely keep time, but beat as the heart of a generation. Doug Clifford once said, "We were told how to play, what to call ourselves. But as CCR, for the first time, we were truly ourselves." From that moment, the journey of a garage band kid to the drummer of one of the greatest American rock groups of the 20th century officially began. Career success. In 1968, with the new name Creedence Clearwater Revival, CCR, 4 young men from El Cerrito officially entered history. In just 4 short years, from 1968 to 1972, CCR released 7 studio albums, sent 14 songs into the Billboard Top 10, and became one of the most successful American bands of their era. In the midst of the psychedelic wave that dominated the charts, they chose a different path. Straightforward, earthy rock, rooted in blues and country, telling stories of small towns, war, rainstorms, and working-class America. And at the center of it all sat Doug Clifford, behind his drums, solid as a heartbeat, never once missing a beat. Their debut album, Creedence Clearwater Revival, 1968, opened with Susie Q, a long, hypnotic cover of Dale Hawkins. The arrangement was unusual. Hazy guitars, snarling vocals, and Doug's drums pounding steadily like marching boots. Susie Q became their first hit, proof that CCR did not need theatrics to command attention. But it was with Bayou Country, 1969, that the band truly exploded. Proud Mary and Born on the Bayou carried them straight into the heart of rock. In Proud Mary, Doug's light but decisive shuffle underpinned John Fogerty's tale of a Mississippi steamboat, a song that would go on to become an American classic. In Born on the Bayou, his drumming rolled like Southern thunder, anchoring the swampy guitar riffs. Just months later came Green River, 1969, featuring hits like Bad Moon Rising and the title track, Green River. In Bad Moon Rising, Doug laid down a bright, buoyant beat, giving the song an almost cheerful feel, even though its lyrics warned of impending doom. It was Clifford's rhythm that masked the unease, turning the song into a paradoxical anthem. In Green River, his crisp, steady pulse echoed like footsteps wandering through the southern landscape. Later that year, Willie and the Poor Boys, 1969, delivered Fortunate Son, where Doug's drumming became a marching cadence of protest. Simple, compact, unadorned. But every strike hit like a direct rebuke to the Vietnam War, turning the track into a generational anthem. CCR's peak arrived with Cosmo's Factory, 1970, named after Doug's own nickname, Cosmo, because he had transformed their rehearsal warehouse into a music factory. Here, Clifford was more than just the timekeeper. He was the quiet engine in the background. The album had everything. Travel in Band, a furious stage starter driven by classic rock and roll beats. Up Around the Bend, upbeat and forward charging. Run Through the Jungle, dense and ominous like echoes of war. And Who'll Stop the Rain, a protest ballad carried by Doug's steady rain-like drumming. In all of them, he remained true to his philosophy. Never overplay, never show off. Yet his simplicity made CCR's music accessible, singable, and timeless. Later in 1970 came Pendulum, the only CCR album to heavily feature brass and keyboards. On Have You Ever Seen the Rain, Doug played with restraint, staying quietly in the background so that John's lyrics could resonate as the sigh of an entire generation. But this was also the point when the band's internal cracks began to show. John Fogerty was taking tighter and tighter control of writing and production. Doug and Stu Cook repeatedly asked for more involvement, but were often dismissed. John wanted everything perfect in his way, Doug recalled, but sometimes he forgot we were a band. Even so, they pushed forward to one final record, Mardi Gras, 1972. This time, in an attempt to ease tensions, John allowed Doug and Stu to contribute songs, but the result backfired. Critics panned the album. Rolling Stone even called it the worst album ever by a major band. Doug, who sang lead on a few of his own compositions, was judged not up to standard, while John took the album as proof that he had been right to keep control all along. The rift widened beyond repair, and CCR dissolved quietly, without fanfare. On stage, Doug Clifford's most memorable moment came at Woodstock 1969. CCR performed at 3 a.m. when the crowd was exhausted, but they unleashed their full energy. Doug drummed as if he were playing to a festival in broad daylight, not to a weary audience. Still, because John was unhappy with the sound, the performance was left out of the official Woodstock film. Doug later admitted his regret. That was a chance to be captured as part of history, and we let it slip away. Throughout CCR's golden years, Doug Clifford was not the one in front of the microphone, nor the man penning immortal lyrics. He was the silent anchor, the drummer who kept CCR steady on stage and in the studio. When John lost his temper after endless retakes, Doug was the one reminding everyone to breathe and get back on track. When tension threatened to split the band apart, he chose loyalty, continuing to play even when he sensed the end was near. In just 4 short years, Creedence Clearwater Revival became a global phenomenon, and Doug Clifford was the man who kept time through the storm. But the cost of glory was decades of bitterness and regret. For Doug, those years were both the brightest chapter and the deepest wound. 4 years drumming for the whole world, followed by a lifetime learning to keep playing on his own. Career after CCR. When Creedence Clearwater Revival disbanded in 1972, Doug Clifford was only 27 years old. It should have been a beginning, but for Doug and Stu Cook, it felt like being cut off in mid-stride, from the top of the world back to zero. John Fogerty chose the solo path, while Doug decided to experiment on his own terms. That same year, he released his first solo album, Cosmo, a project inspired by his long-standing nickname. The record revealed a different Doug Clifford, not only a drummer, but also a songwriter and lead vocalist. Cosmo blended rock, funk, and even soul, showing a more diverse palette than CCR. Although it did not achieve commercial success, collectors and rock enthusiasts came to regard it as proof that Doug could step into the spotlight instead of remaining forever behind the drum kit. Yet Doug himself later admitted, "I was never really a singer. I just wanted to see if I could tell my own story." After Cosmo, Doug quietly moved into the background for a time, testing himself as a producer. He collaborated with artists like Doug Somm, Steve Miller, and especially the Sir Douglas Quintet. Clifford gave them his solid, dependable beat, while also learning the intricacies of running a recording session, skills he rarely had the chance to practice during CCR's strict regime. By the late 1970s, Doug and Stu Cook decided to form the Clifford Cook Band, releasing one self-titled album in 1979. The project failed to make an impact, but it highlighted the enduring bond between two childhood friends, men who had once been overshadowed by John Fogerty, now trying to assert themselves. When the album faltered commercially, they shifted back into roles as musicians and producers on other projects. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Doug Clifford stayed largely out of the public eye, but worked steadily behind the scenes. He was involved in the reissues of CCR's catalog, helping to compile, remaster, and preserve the band's legacy. When a CCR reunion was ruled out due to unresolved conflicts with John, Doug and Stu founded Creedence Clearwater Revisited in 1995. This new touring band, with additional musicians, dedicated itself to performing CCR's entire legacy, from Proud Mary to Fortunate Son. With Revisited, Doug returned to his natural role, the drummer. For more than 2 decades, they toured worldwide, bringing CCR's music to audiences who had never experienced the original band. The project faced criticism and even lawsuits from John Fogerty, who claimed the name created confusion, but Doug stood firm. For him, Revisited was not about replacing CCR, but about keeping its spirit alive. "We didn't want people to forget CCR. This was our way of saying the music still lives," he explained. Doug Clifford also continued to appear on collaborative projects. He played with Tom Fogerty during the older brother's brief solo career before Tom's death in 1990. He recorded with country and rock artists in California, always holding to the same philosophy. He didn't need to stand out, only to keep the beat steady. As old age approached, Doug gradually stepped away from long tours. Yet his post-CCR career proved one thing: he never stopped playing. From Cosmo to Revisited, from the studio to the stage, Doug Clifford remained loyal to his essential role, the man who kept time so that everything else didn't fall apart. If CCR had been his brightest chapter, then the decades that followed were proof that Doug Clifford was not just John Fogerty's drummer, but an independent musician, a guardian of legacy, and the quiet gatekeeper ensuring CCR's music would never fade. Turmoil and shadows. No collapse ever happens in a single moment. For Creedence Clearwater Revival, the downfall came slowly, like a faint crack spreading through each album, each rehearsal, each glance that no longer looked in the same direction. Doug Clifford, the steadiest timekeeper of the group, didn't create the conflict, but he also couldn't save a band that was unraveling piece by piece. After a streak of unimaginable success, John Fogerty, the band's voice and creative soul, tightened his control over every artistic decision. Doug and Stu Cook, once childhood friends, were pushed into the role of hired hands. They had no say in production and weren't encouraged to contribute new songs. "We were a band, but we weren't treated as equals," Doug said. "John did everything, decided everything, and by then, it wasn't CCR anymore." The breaking point came in 1972. After Tom Fogerty, John's brother and the band's rhythm guitarist, quit. John refused to replace him. Instead, he delivered a strange ultimatum. The next album, Mardi Gras, would be a shared project, with songs written and sung equally by the 3 remaining members. Doug and Stu, neither of whom were natural lead singers or primary songwriters, were suddenly forced to step into the front line. They weren't ready, but they agreed. "I knew I wasn't Lennon or McCartney," Doug admitted, "but I thought, if this is what it takes to keep the band together, I'll do it." The result was a disaster. Mardi Gras was torn apart by critics. Rolling Stone called it one of the worst albums ever released by a major band. Doug was criticized as a skilled drummer who should never have sung. Things grew worse when John refused to join the promotional tour, leaving his 2 former friends to face the backlash alone. A few months later, CCR broke up. No press statement, no farewell on stage. Just a quiet end, in the very manner Doug Clifford had always lived. But this time, silence wasn't enough. We could have lasted many more years, but ego killed that band. And no, I'm not talking about myself. Clifford released a solo album, Cosmo, soon after, an attempt to find his own voice amid CCR's ashes. But commercially, it failed. He later joined the Don Harrison Band, another rock project that didn't last long either. Worse still was John Fogerty's silence. For 2 decades, he refused to perform any CCR songs, cutting off all contact with his former bandmates. When CCR was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993, Fogerty even refused to share the stage with Clifford and Cook. The 2 men who had once kept time for him stood there, empty-handed, in front of applause, and his averted gaze. Doug spoke little about that humiliation. He only said, "I was there for the music, not for John." That was the first forgotten strike, and not the last. Personal life. In the rock world, filled with scandals, violence, and self-destruction, Doug Clifford was a rare exception, a musician who chose silence even at the height of fame. When CCR broke up, he didn't drown himself in parties to forget, didn't badmouth his bandmates in the press, didn't pull the spotlight toward himself. He withdrew, not out of bitterness, but simply because he had always lived that way. Doug married relatively early and built a quiet family life, far from the media. He never appeared on tabloid covers, never had a public affair, never endured a headline-grabbing divorce like so many of his peers. In an era when musicians often define themselves by rebellion, he did the opposite. He built a discreet home, a place where he could do the one thing he was best at: keeping time, this time not just for music, but for life itself. For many years in the Tahoe region, with its clear lake and quiet forests, Clifford lived like an ordinary middle-class man, driving a pickup truck, doing his own grocery shopping, fixing his house, and only occasionally revealing that he had once been the drummer of one of the greatest bands in American rock history. "I don't live in the past, but I know I'm lucky to have had it," he said in a rare interview. He remained close to Stu Cook, his longtime friend and bandmate. Together they founded Creedence Clearwater Revisited in 1995, performing hundreds of shows around the world every year, despite criticism that it was CCR without Fogerty. Doug never offered excuses. "I play the songs I helped create. I don't need anyone's permission to play them." Throughout his career, he never wrote a memoir. No podcasts exposing backstage stories, no never-before-heard secret tapes. For Doug Clifford, what was past stayed in the past. And what mattered, music, would speak for itself. Yet not everything was peaceful. In 2024, his son, Brent Clifford, was accused of murdering his girlfriend in Nevada. The news spread quickly across American media, always tied to the phrase, "the son of Creedence Clearwater Revival's drummer." Doug made no public statement, no defense, no denial. That silence, for others perhaps avoidance, was for him likely just the familiar way of a man who never believed in shouting to be understood. Looking back on his life, Doug once said, "I wasn't the guy who amazed the crowd. I just wanted to make them nod their heads to the beat. If they did that, I'd done my job." He didn't change the world with lyrics, but perhaps with his steady drum beat, he helped countless people get through the turbulence of their own lives, the same way he survived his childhood, the fractures, the betrayals, and still carried on. Legacy and influence. In a band, people usually remember the voice first, the melody second, and almost forget the drums, unless they go wrong. Doug Clifford understood that very early, and perhaps because of it, he chose to exist not through spotlight, but through steadiness. No flashy technique, no self-indulgent solos. Clifford simply played at the right time, in the right place. And that was exactly what made him irreplaceable in Creedence Clearwater Revival. From 1968 to 1972, Doug Clifford and CCR helped define a new rock language, raw, gritty, rebellious, without being noisy. In every hit, Proud Mary, Down on the Corner, Fortunate Son, Green River, Clifford's drumming was like the bloodstream running through it, keeping the songs from collapsing amid urgent guitar riffs and surging vocals. He didn't stand out, but he made everything else stand out. Clifford proved that you don't have to be a songwriter, you don't have to be the lead singer. A drummer can still be the foundation of a legacy. Throughout his career, he rejected every definition of great drummer in the showman's sense. "I don't care if I'm on any top list," he once said. "I just want to be remembered as the drummer who never betrayed the song." More than a musical symbol, Doug Clifford left a mark on how an artist could live after glory. While many stars clung desperately to fading fame, he chose quiet consistency, steady performances without calculation. With Creedence Clearwater Revisited, he and Stu Cook brought CCR's music to millions of later generation fans, those who never saw the original band but still felt that unyielding, authentic spirit in every note. They performed in more than 15 countries for over 2 decades, without Fogerty, but enough to make audiences rise and nod their heads in rhythm. Among drummers, Clifford earned respect not for complexity, but for principle. He was one of the few drummers of the 1960s to 70s who was never replaced, never discarded, never lost his essence. Younger drummers in Southern rock, roots rock, and Americana, from Steve Gorman of the Black Crowes to Patrick Carney of the Black Keys, were all influenced to some degree by Clifford's ethos of playing for the song. Notably, the beat in Fortunate Son, CCR's most iconic anti-war anthem, was listed among the most influential political drum beats of the 20th century. Not because it was complex, but because it struck at the right time, with the right force, carrying a message that never ages. Doug Clifford never won a major individual award, never graced the cover of Rolling Stone, never ranked on the lists of the greatest drummers of all time. But that was never what he sought. For him, being the one behind, keeping things from falling apart, was enough. If the audience nods their heads to my beat, then I know I'm doing it right. If not, I don't blame them. I'll adjust myself. Doug Clifford. His legacy doesn't lie in the spotlight, but in the steady rhythm that made others shine. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring thing of all. Present life. In 2020, Doug Clifford and Stu Cook officially announced the end of Creedence Clearwater Revisited after more than 25 years of touring. There was no grand farewell, no drawn-out final tour like so many of their contemporaries. Just a short announcement to the press followed by silence. Just as he had entered music, Clifford stepped out of the spotlight without making a sound. After thousands of shows across dozens of countries, Clifford returned to Lake Tahoe, where he had spent most of his life since CCR's breakup. No more nightly drumming, no more strange hotel rooms, no more roaring crowds. But he felt no regret. "I've been drumming for over 60 years. Now I want to know what it feels like to live without counting beats," he shared with a local magazine. But silence for Clifford never meant an ending. In 2020, amid the COVID-19 pandemic, he unexpectedly released Magic Window, a solo album recorded back in 1985, but left forgotten in his personal archives for more than 3 decades. Doug had played all the instruments himself: drums, bass, guitar, and vocals. crafting a sound far from CCR, leaning toward a lighter, more personal pop rock. A year later, he followed with For All the Money in the World, a collaboration with Doug Sahm and Bobby Whitlock. No loud promotion, no tours, just a whisper from the past, sent to those who still remembered. Though no longer performing, Clifford has kept in touch with fans through rare interviews. In one 2021 appearance, when asked what made him proudest, he didn't mention any hits, nor did he bring up CCR. He simply replied, "I never betrayed a song. I always played for the music, not for ego." Yet life has not been entirely peaceful. In August 2024, his son, Brent Clifford, was charged with murdering his girlfriend in Nevada. The shocking news quickly spread, and Doug's name was pulled into headlines. Son of CCR drummer charged with murder. Doug made no appearance, no statement, no interview. For him, perhaps silence was the only way left to protect what was most fragile: family. In 2025, Doug Clifford turned 80. No tribute ceremony, no grand retrospective projects. He lives simply, still recording at home, occasionally sending tracks to friends, and doing nothing more. Not because he has run out of ideas, but because he has had enough. Doug Clifford once drummed for a divided America, kept time for a band caught in the storm of power and creativity, lived in the shadow of those more prominent than himself. But he never fell from his place, and in the twilight of life, he still chooses the old way, stepping back, not because he was left behind, but because that was always his choice. Doug Clifford never stood at center stage to receive the applause reserved for conquerors. He never won major individual awards, never appeared on the lists of the greatest of all time. But for more than 6 decades, he never once played the drums for the wrong reason. When CCR was blazing, he kept the beat. When CCR fell apart, he still kept the beat. When pushed out of the spotlight, forgotten at the Hall of Fame, erased from the official history, he didn't protest, didn't struggle. He simply chose to keep drumming, not for anyone, but because music still needed a pulse. In an industry where people often shout to be noticed, Doug Clifford went the other way. The older he grew, the quieter he became. And strangely enough, that silence is what made him irreplaceable. He didn't play drums to impress. He played to keep fragile things from collapsing. He didn't dwell on the past, nor beg to be remembered. And perhaps because of that, he is remembered longer than most who once owned the spotlight. At 80, while much of the generation he lived and played alongside is fading away, Doug Clifford endures, not as a statue built to a legend, but as the last heartbeat of an era that was honest, raw, and unpretentious. I don't need to stand in the middle of the stage. As long as I can still hear myself play, that's enough. He is the last timekeeper of Creedence, the last friend still playing alongside Stu Cook, the final drummer when everything else has gone silent. And what about you? In a world growing louder every day, is there still anyone patient enough to sit in the back, making sure things don't fall apart? If Doug Clifford's story resonates with you, share your thoughts below. And if you love CCR, if you value the quiet but enduring ones, don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because there will always be a need for someone to keep the beat. And you've just met one of the very best who ever did it.